All right, so we'll go ahead. With respect to the speakers, I will be your first presenter today and handling the legal aspects of the reserve studies. For those of you who perhaps don't know me yet, my name is Ellen Troop and I am an attorney with Elmore and Troop. We basically take care of all sorts of communities throughout Maryland. We have clients anywhere from Ocean City up to the northern aspects of Elkton, Maryland, and all the way over to Hagerstown. We are a full service law firm, so we can provide you with revisions and complete rewrites of your governing documents. We can also provide you with legal opinions as to whatever topic is necessary, and of course, then deal with those fun, cumbersome collections. We do represent all sorts of communities. We represent the homeowners associations, the condominiums, the cooperatives, any of those associations that might have mixed use aspects, as well as perhaps some more unique communities, such as a horse racing training facility and marina as well. The other two speakers, I will now pass on to them to let each of them introduce themselves. Michelle.
Thank you, Ellen. Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle, and I am with Reserve Advisors. Our firm specializes in reserve studies. It's what we do day in and day out for community associations. Similar to Ellen, we work with HOAs, condominiums across the whole state of Maryland. During the presentation today, I'm going to cover how associations should plan for success, which is a reserve study. So we're going to cover what a reserve study is, why it's important, and how you as an association can utilize it. With that, I'll pass it over to Kim.
So I work for Wintrust Community Advantage. We are a bank. And so my role here today is to speak generally to what can be expected by a board or a manager where there's a funding gap, and what to anticipate in the way of what the lender's going to ask you for, what red flags to watch out for, and how long the process will take, and the guidelines that are used in obtaining a loan. So with that, I will turn the mic back over to Ellen, so Ellen can begin the discussion about legal topics. There we go.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I apologize for what I cannot see, so I'm sort of operating a little bit blind here, literally. But I've got panelists who are giving me the thumbs up, thumbs down, and little commentaries about, no, we see your desk. Anyway, gotta love the electronics. Going forward, and hopefully much better. So dealing with the reserves, let's address why an association must plan. For the board members, you specifically have that fiduciary duty to take care of the most critical aspect of the association that starts first and foremost, and that is your finances. So the problem with this is that it's one thing to handle your money, but it's absolutely another thing to handle all the money of all your neighbors. You've got to do it very well. And if you would go to the next slide, Michelle, there's a couple ways to make sure that you do this as well as possible. You want to perform it in a good faith. Serve your neighbors as you would yourself, and then step it up a level or two. You want to consider all the professionals, work with them, so to determine that you are actually providing the appropriate care of that money. We are not all financial planners. We are not all reserve professionals. We are not all bankers. Reach out to them. They deal with the monies all the time, and that will help provide you with completing and complying with your fiduciary duty. Attorney Wayne Hyatt has told us very simply and directly that it is your undivided loyalty and honesty to the association and its membership. So the interest of the association and your neighbors with respect to money needs to be higher than it is for yourself, and you should be in good situation. Also keep in mind that you do have the privilege, if you will, provided you comply with your fiduciary duty, to rely on the business judgment rule. And that's the essence, that the board reached out to all the appropriate professionals, it reviewed the governing law, it reviewed the governing documents, and made a decision in good faith and with good interest. That will carry you very far. Next slide, please. So what do you do with this fiduciary duty as it relates to the reserves? Well, there's 4 different steps, and we'll walk through them today. The first part is you want to actually create that reserve funding. That's where working with a reserve company will carry you and take you through that first step. Then you want to go ahead, of course, and fund the reserves. And part of that is to handle the budgeting aspects. You'll work with your management company. You'll work with the reserve information that you've gleaned from your reserve study that you are now holding in your hands. Then once you have funded the reserves, you want to manage the reserves properly. You need to take a look at your governing documents and the governing law to tell you not only how much to be funded, but also then ultimately how you can properly and within your powers spend the reserves for whatever particular projects are required. The last thing you need to do is also consider to protect the reserves. The reserves sit there for you in an account. Some board members seem to think that, oh, the reserves are this wonderful bank account. We know better. That's not just a random bank account. The reserves are set aside for particular items, your capital improvements, your capital replacements, and that's where the board needs to step in and make sure that those reserves are properly funded and stay through the years so that you can maintain your community in the way that you wish. There's one thing I do want you to take from today, if you don't take away anything else. With respect to the reserves, do not procrastinate in getting the reserves funded. That starts the biggest and safest thing for the boards working forward. And as we go through this presentation, you will understand what is coming down with respect to laws that already might apply or new laws that are likely to be coming through the legislature. So again, don't procrastinate. That is key. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, don't procrastinate. Why? Well, as we look at the general aspect through the state, right now there's no specific state funding for your reserves. It's pretty general. If you look at the Condominium Act, for example, it says you need to provide the annual budget. You need to provide in the annual budget reserves. Well, that doesn't tell you 3%, 5%, but you continue on. The resale packages, again, no particular mandate at this time in state law, but it does reference that the reserves need to be accounted for in the resale package. So going back then to your fiduciary duty, it would be, and it is, prudent practice to take care of protecting the association now and in 1 year, in 5 years, and 10 years by setting up a proper reserve fund based upon a proper reserve study. I do want to point out that there is actually already, Prince George's County has a specific reserve study requirement that came into effect in October 2020, and it is gaining a lot of momentum. Why? Because it's a prudent thing to do. So as we're sitting here today, right now, there is a bill in Montgomery County, pretty much identical to what Prince George's has with respect to the reserves. And there is also a bill pending in the state legislature that would apply to all counties and not just the individual counties. Next slide, please. Because what seems to be coming, and because Montgomery County has essentially copied Prince George's County, we do want to take a little bit more focus of what's going on in Prince George's County. And here's just some quick highlights that are very, very critical for each of you to understand. And again, why I emphasize that as an association board member or management, you do not want to procrastinate. The associations in the county or in the state, all depending what comes through, you will need to complete a reserve study once every 5 years. The particular code, again, that is similar to what is likely to be coming forth, references that you have to work with a qualified preparer, and it gives you all sorts of information of who constitutes a qualified preparer for this reserve study. And there's also a corresponding requirement that once this reserve study is completed, that information has to show up in the budget information and to be provided to all your owners. So that the counties and the state want to make it very clear for the owners, the financial status, not just of this year, but of what's coming, so that everyone is not surprised in 3 years as to a large cost that may need to be incurred. Now, why is this a little daunting, if you will? Well, the associations, at least for Prince George's County, definitely, but also probably fairly similar to what might be coming forth in the state, those associations have to have this reserve study completed by October 1st of this year. That's not far off whatsoever when you think about it, because you need to go out, get your request for proposal, find hopefully 3 reserve study companies that you might be comfortable with, talk to them, get the bids in, make the selection, and you need to give them time to do it. The reserve study companies will be in high demand, certainly already are in Prince George's County. And if it goes through in this state, that desire to have a good reserve study company will be even higher. The other interesting piece that shows up that is perhaps a little daunting is that the reserves have to match what the reserve study indicates. And that has to be done again as soon as possible, October 1st. Most of our companies, I think most of our associations probably are a little bit challenged with respect to the reserves. Is it 60%? Is it 80%? You need to take a look at that funding, and that could be an absolute substantial amount. The other aspect that is also good in a way is that the requirement to actually get those reserves funded, it will supersede whatever is in your documents, as is typical. If it's a county law, the county law is going to prevail over your documents. And if it becomes a state law, it will also prevail over your documents. But they went ahead and for Prince George's County, they at least provided that. So that's helpful. Then there's also powers and privileges as to the boards being able to increase those assessments so that they can do this funding in the time that it would be. So when you take a look at this Prince George's County, there's a lot of information that's likely to carry through to the state. And this is a new premise. Funding reserves is now likely to be an absolute mandate, not optional. So you want to take a look at that, and then the powers to assess. Next slide, please. So once your reserve has been determined that you have to have it and how you have to have it, then you want to go to the next level, and this is part of managing your reserves, is what can those reserves be used for? The state law, the county laws at the moment, they're not dipping into that equation, which is good. So as true to form, you need to check your documents. Your documents can vary as to what your reserves can be used for. I gave you the second provision up on the screen, shows you just a very short sample. Elements that come up with the reserve usages, they can vary. They can reference that at a limited time, say perhaps for the year only. They can tell you how you can withdraw it, how much can be withdrawn, and for what particular purposes. It might say only for improvements, only for capital replacements. And so sometimes you may find a little difficulty if the documents don't allow for, say, significant litigation. A lot of the documents do have a little catch-all provision that says, and as determined by the board. So again, as always with any type of legal aspect, you do need to know your documents and you need to take a look at them. Next slide, please. So once you've gone through, you've got your reserve funding has been set, you figured out how you can use it, when you can use it, and for what purposes. Then just part of your management that you also need to do is, as you go through from month to month, you want to check that your reserve fund still matches with your reserve study. So next year, where is it? Is it higher or lower? Check each of the components so you're not, say, missing a $20,000 component that you somehow didn't then adjust your budget correspondingly. So that's always important. That reserve study is an absolute fabulous tool to be used now, if it goes through the law, every 5 years. So match those two together so that you don't miss anything. The other aspect that comes up, and we'll now touch on, is when you're talking about how to get the money into the reserve fund, there's various different ways that you can work with management and then reach out to your professionals, such as Kim, with respect to banks, because you may need to do some sort of combination of everything. From raising assessments in a given budget year, you might need to handle some special assessments for a project. You might need to borrow the money, as I mentioned, for a different project. All of that is, it's a coordination that working with management will help you as well. Next slide, please. So what typically addresses how you can use those reserves, and can you use that reserve perhaps in a creative way? Well, first of all, usually your larger projects are going to perhaps tax your reserve fund, at least for right now, until you are fully funded as in accordance with any type of law coming through. But those larger projects, often the best answer is to deal with a loan from a bank that has in the past and knows how to deal with associations, understands the income stream, because that is what the associations are pledging as far as to be able to pay the bank back. And there are luckily now a lot of banks, or few banks, I should say, that really understand the associations and can work with you such that you can complete that larger project. Once again, as you're working through with your professional bank, you do need to check within your documents to see what actions might be required for any type of loan to undertake, whether it's just the board that can handle that, or whether some sort of vote has to be acquired and obtained from the owners at any point in time. All right, next slide, please. With respect to condominiums, and this is again dealing with where we are just today, keep in mind with all the reserve information that is, well, now in Prince George's County and maybe coming through from Montgomery County and the state, the reserves are going to be a very hot item. And that hot item is also true for the FHA. Previously, the FHA has basically outlined reserve requirements, again, to make sure that if they are going to back any type of loan, that the condominium is in good financial order. I suspect, as the slide references, that the FHA, if these laws come through with respect to the reserve funding, the reference in the previous requirement having 10% of the budget and being allocated to the reserves, that's probably going to change. Because you've got to perhaps do a special assessment to get it up to that particular amount. Hi, Kim, I see you. I don't see our screen anymore. I don't know what happened. I see me now. Can anyone hear me? Okay, we can hear. All right, well, I don't know. I see Kim's face and all right, well, we'll just continue. This is always a learning process, if you would.
Yeah,
So
Ellen, I can hear you. I don't know where Michelle went, so.
We did lose the screen, it looks like. So hopefully, again, this is why we pre-prepared to send everybody the screenshots as a matter, and I'm going to try to see now that I can see me. All right, there we go. So I don't know, we will give her a little bit and I'll just continue addressing the FHA and hopefully she will get back on because she is our host. So I think that will come back in. She'll be able to get back in.
I am so sorry. I think my internet cut out. Is everyone able to see the presentation again?
Yes, we can.
Sorry
Welcome.
about that.
It's beautiful, beautiful. So we figured you'd be able to get back online. All right, so what I was just addressing was kind of point 2 is with the reserve study laws coming through that may actually come to fruition this year, is that I suspect FHA will change a little bit of its requirements to what's required to be allocated. If by October 1st of this year, everyone's required to have funding in accordance with the reserve study, that 10% might be absolutely inapplicable or it might be too low. So keep an eye on that could change as well. But also note that the FHA does require adequate funding for insurance coverage and related deductibles. That's going to continue. And again, because everybody's worried about the amount of money and how the boards are complying, previously the FHA had the requirement about dealing with replacements and enough funds for the next 2 years. Well, I imagine, again, if those new laws come into effect, the FHA will probably end up changing its verbiage to address based upon the reserve study or some other formula so that there's a little connection, but that certainly could take a while. The other aspects with FHA that's always seem to come up, I think everybody's probably got a pretty good handle on them, but just as a reminder is that if you are seeking FHA certification, you still need to watch your delinquencies. They cannot be more than 15% with respect to the number of owners. That's counting assessments only, and that arrearage time frame is 60 days. You still need to have the appropriate fidelity bonds, and that's at the moment dealing with 3 months in assessments. Here's the kicker, because everything's all interrelated, plus your reserves. Now, if your reserves are required now to be, instead of, I'll make up a number, instead of 400,000, your reserves have to be 1.2 million based upon your reserve study that you are going to get, that's going to possibly affect all your FHA certification. So you've got to be careful there. Check with your reserve study specialist, check with the FHA, keep an eye on that, and as needed, reach out to your legal counsel. The owner occupancy is still, I think everybody pretty much knows for most of your bigger condominiums that you have to have at least 50% owner occupied. So lots of changes could be coming through, all based upon reserves. Next slide, please. All right, so as a board member and then indirectly as your managers too, you still have that duty to guard the reserves. That's kind of the final piece of what you want to do. If you're going to do any type of investing, do make sure that it's a conservative investing. You don't want to put it on the stock market. That's just going to create a lot of problems. Management certainly can guide you with various ways to handle that conservative investing so you can get that whole whopping 1.2%. That's always great. But there's ways to craft it, still make it available for those major projects, but perhaps squeak a little bit money out of it. Things that you want to do as well is avoid any type of invitation for embezzling on those big funds accounts. Sometimes double signatures might be helpful. Making sure that management has all its appropriate bonds, that it's got its appropriate insurance, and that the condominiums or associations insurance is up to date to protect the community in the event that there is any problem. As a board member, probably the best thing to be doing is, oh, if you'd go back just a moment. Oh, that's okay. There we go. The one thing I was going to say, the most important thing to do as a board member, and when you're dealing with the finances, that is truly the heart of the community that begins with, and it's also probably the first area that people doubt and want to challenge because it's their money and they're concerned that you didn't do it right, or let's be serious, you didn't do it their way. So as these monthly reports are coming through from management, take a look at those and make sure that you're seeing the full, complete money flow. If a big payment went out, okay, good. It went to appropriate party pursuant to that particular contract. And make sure you've got enough information in your monthly reports to address all your questions. Your financial statements you want to see, balance sheets, income statement, have that ready so that you have a good sense of the finances. The other aspect that comes up, generally speaking, with all your money is audits. Again, take a look at your documents. They might provide a audit requirement, and certain times actions might say this would be a good time to audit. Changeover of management is common as noted. And if you've gone through a large or expensive project, and again, take a look at those contracts. If a contract said you paid that $200,000, well, why are you looking at a total payment of $215,000? Oh, there was a change in that contract. You just want to be able to justify all your expenditures as well as all the income. All right, next slide, please. So one thing that comes up is, again, challenges dealing with money, and for the whole reserves, because your reserves usually have a significant amount of money, and that's for your big projects, meaning it's a lot of money again. So what do you want to do? If you've got that major reconstruction, go back to the prudent person and how you would handle that. You want to make sure that you're relying on the appropriate professionals. You've got perhaps a project manager. If it's smaller, management might be capable of doing that. But if it's a big, massive rebuild, that is probably beyond the abilities of most management companies. So reach out for a qualified engineer to be that project manager. Make sure you've got those contracts in line, that they've been vetted, they cover your scope of work appropriately so that the management of that contract will go through. You want to have good, solid contractors. I mean, all of that normal process of dealing with a large construction project comes into play when you have to justify why $300,000 came out of the reserves. Did you follow the process with respect to the board internally? Did the owners need to vote? Did you need to provide notice or anything along those lines? So there's various avenues to avoid any reserve expenditure challenges. All right. And that takes care, I believe, for me as to what I wish to address. And now I will pass the mic over to Michelle. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ellen. Sorry for the technical difficulties, everyone. Not sure how my internet cut out or why, but I'm glad we're all back and able to move forward. Just a reminder, if you could please type the questions in the Q&A instead of the chat. That way we're kind of only looking in one place, and we'll try to address all the questions at the end. We'll make sure to stay on, that we have enough time to address all of those. Okay, so now that we know the importance of reserves, we'll discuss how you plan for reserves. What is a reserve study and how do you utilize it when you've had one completed? So what is a reserve study? This definition is taken right from CAI, the Community Associations Institute. They do have national reserve study standards, and they define a reserve study as a two-part process. So it's both a physical evaluation and a financial analysis of your community. So we'll dive into all of these sections right after this, but in quick summary, the physical evaluation contains the property classification, an on-site inspection, a life analysis, and then valuation or cost estimates for those replacement items. Once when the physical evaluation is completed, you then have enough information, or the reserve specialist has enough information to determine that expenditure plan. So typical horizon would be 30 years. We're looking at a 30-year period and capturing all those reserve expenses. And once when that's been done, the next step is the financial analysis. So that is where we are actually recommending the reserve contributions, how much you should contribute to this reserve account to offset those expenditures. And it does include a current fund status and a suggested funding plan. Fund status being how much money do you have at the time the study is completed, and then the plan for the duration of the study, which, like I said, is typically 30 years. So diving into these a little bit deeper, what is a physical valuation? How is that determined? The first step is the property classification. So the reserve specialist or the engineer is reviewing your legal documents, they're reviewing the operating budget, and then they're having a conversation with the board and or management to help categorize the property. So everything throughout the community should be classified as one of these 5 sections. So it could possibly be homeowner maintained. So if it's an HOA and it's single family homes maintained by the homeowners, we'd say the homes and the lots are individually maintained or homeowner maintained. If it's a condominium, the interior of the unit, that's something that would be homeowner maintained, so excluded from the reserve study. There could be elements on your property that are maintained by others. Maybe the streets are maintained by the municipality. Maybe USPS maintains the mailbox stations. There might be a perimeter fence that actually a neighboring community maintains. So it is important to call out items that are on the property and that are excluded because they're not the association's maintenance responsibility. Someone else, another entity, is responsible for that. It could be something that the association is responsible for maintaining, but it's handled out of the operating budget. And really what we mean there is it's kind of below a threshold cost. A general rule of thumb for that threshold is about 1% of the budget. So if an association has a budget of say $200,000, we'd set that cutoff around $2,000. And that means anything under $2,000 should likely be funded through general maintenance or operating, and anything over $2,000 probably qualifies as a reserve expense outside of any reoccurring annual expenditures, right? If you have, let's say, like an insurance premium, we wouldn't want that to be funded out of reserves. These are the long-term big ticket item costs above that threshold cost. And that's really important to discuss during that kickoff meeting when you're having the study prepared, to make sure that you align with the provider and that the reserve study provider understands how you want to plan and what you want to fund out of the operating account and what you'd like to fund out of the reserve account. The next section is long-lived elements. So these are elements that don't have a predictable remaining useful life. So the example I like to give is for a building, or say like a clubhouse. We know you'll have to replace the roof, perform facade repairs, replace the windows and doors. If there's a deck or a balcony, you'll have to repair that. But the actual structural frame of the building should last its entirety. You don't want to fund or plan on having to replace that entire structure, right? So the structural frame of that building would be considered long-lived. We're not going to fund for it through the reserve account or plan on that needing to be replaced. And then if it doesn't fall into one of those 4 categories, it's a reserve component and should be included in your reserve study. So in summary, reserve components are association responsibility. The association needs to be responsible for maintaining and replacing that element. It has to have a limited and predictable remaining useful life, and it has to be above that minimum threshold cost. So some common reserve components. For an HOA or a master association, it might be a gated community with private streets. Maybe there's some fencing, possibly a playground, a clubhouse, pool, tennis court, or some signage. If it's a condominium that's townhome style, you'll possibly have all of those items we just mentioned that you would see in an HOA, and then also likely the exteriors of the townhome buildings. So roofs, exterior wall finishes, possibly decks, stoops, maybe even the driveways at the units. And then if it's an apartment or a high-rise style property, in addition to the possible site components and the exterior of the building, you're also going to have now interiors as well as mechanical equipment. So possibly elevators, maybe a parking garage, light safety systems, HVAC systems, electrical systems, those interior renovations for common spaces like a lobby or a hallway or a fitness room. These are all pretty standard or typical components, but the true inventory is really determined during that on-site meeting and condition assessment. So the next step, when we've classified everything and the property, is to do that inspection. So what are we doing during the inspection? Well, the engineer is both quantifying and performing a condition assessment. So how do we quantify the reserve components? Well, if it's a new community, if we're doing a reserve study for a community that's not quite built yet, maybe by a builder or developer, then it's common to use plans. So we've used construction plans to actually get takeoffs for pavement, for fencing, for the building exteriors, you name it. Once when the community is established, it's more commonplace to actually measure while you're on site. So we truly are measuring fences, measuring pavement, sidewalks, quantifying light poles and fixtures, really quantifying everything that the engineer observes. And then for mechanical equipment, it's important to get the model and serial number so we can research the equipment when we come back to the office. While quantifying, we're also performing a condition assessment. So based on the age, on the relative age, what condition are these elements in? How have they held up over time? Do we anticipate the streets needing to be replaced near term, or are they still in fair condition and have multiple years left of their useful life? The next step is the life analysis. So the first step in that is determining the useful life. So how is the useful life for a component determined? Well, sometimes there are manufacturer recommendations and warranties that are taken into account. Could be the quality of materials used. That's really, really important. Not all retaining walls, for example, are equal. If you have a timber retaining wall, it's going to have a different useful life than, say, a masonry retaining wall. Same even for a fence. Is it a galvanized fence or is it vinyl coated? Is your asphalt roof, is it 3-tab or is it laminate? The quality of materials that were used will really play into the anticipated useful life for that component. And then it's also important to take into account any unique conditions. So weather can absolutely play an effect on the useful life. Areas that are more prone to a lot of freeze and thaw, that really beats up the pavement and it won't get quite the useful life than it would, say, in a southern climate like Georgia or Florida. Coastal exposure is really big too. For those coastal communities over in the Ocean City area, that salt air really, really beats up the building and corrodes, causes corrosion in metal elements. So we really can't expect the same useful life for a coastal community for most components than you would in more of an inland type community. So there are definitely unique conditions that will play into the anticipated useful life. So how do you determine the remaining useful life as part of the life analysis? Well, you'd start with the useful life minus the age, right? So that's a great starting point, assuming that there wasn't a condition assessment performed. But there is, and that's what really, really will govern that remaining useful life. So we'll want to understand the history of maintenance and the prior replacements, what's gone on with that element since it was installed 8, 12, 25 years ago, and what condition was observed. I'd like to use the example of pavement. Maybe we give pavement a useful life of 15 to 20 years, and we go out to a property and the pavement's 17 years old and it's still in fair condition. Well, we're not going to say you need to replace the pavement in 3 years just because it's at the end of its quote unquote useful life. We'd really defer pavement based on the condition that's observed. So if we think it's going to last another 8 years or 10 years, that's what we're going to recommend that you fund for and plan on. The condition assessment really governs that remaining useful life. Technology is really important to consider too. This is most common with mechanical equipment. There's just constant technology advancements that are really changing the way mechanical equipment is treated and the way it's replaced. So as parts become obsolete or technology changes, you might not get that typical useful life that we would have anticipated a few years ago. So it's important both for us reserve study providers to stay on top of that, as well as the associations. The more of that information you can rely to your reserve specialist, the more accurate the reserve study will be. I was on the phone with a manager earlier this week, and they used the analogy that a parent knows the baby best, and that's really applicable to associations. And I found that to be really true. The various vendors that you work with are like the babysitters, right? We're going to come in, we're going to get to know the child, we'll know the baby, we'll see certain things, but you as the parent really know best. So as your vendors are telling you that these parts are becoming obsolete, make sure that is relayed to the reserve specialist. Or if you don't have a reserve study, make sure that you're at least planning for those things. Know that these near-term costs are coming faster than what was once anticipated. So the part 4, the last step of the physical valuation, is that valuation or cost estimates. So any historical cost of replacement that you have are very helpful and useful. So make sure you provide those to the reserve specialist that's preparing your study. It's important to make sure that local labor and material rates are used. The cost of a roof is different in Ocean City versus Baltimore versus Kansas, right? So it is important that local labor and material rates are utilized. It's really important to take into account demolition and disposal costs. If you need to replace a playground and you find a great one online for say $20,000, you can't budget on that $20,000 because you probably have a playground there now that you need to demo and then remove, haul it away. You have to dispose of it somewhere. Then you have to ship that brand new playground that you just ordered to your property, and you need someone to install it. So it's not just the sticker price. You need to make sure that you're taking into account all the other various factors that go with these replacements. And that's the same whether it's a playground, a fence, you name it. Demolition, disposal, and installation have to be taken into account as well. And it's really important to take into account inflation. So when a reserve study is conducted, everything is in current dollars. So we're going to say the cost to replace a roof in 2021 is X, but we don't anticipate you needing to do that for another 9 years. Well, that cost probably won't be the same in 9 years. So it is important to make sure that you are taking into account inflation. I think it's really important to mention here, when I say in 2021 dollars, we do acknowledge that the pandemic has really altered costs. Just with factories having to shut down, there's been limited supply, there's also limited labor. And so associations that have to do near-term projects have experienced much higher costs than we would have anticipated a year or two ago. And we know that. And even though we're saying costs are in 2021 dollars, we don't want to anticipate these inflation, like these large differences in costs over a 30-year study, right? So if you do have to do the project, if we're recommending you do it this year or next, based on the condition, then the cost might be slightly higher. But if it's a project that's going 9 years out, we're hoping that the market is going to stabilize and normalize and get back to normal costs. So we would not want to take that into account. So that's something to discuss as well during that kickoff meeting. So like I said, after that physical evaluation that's completed, the engineer can then go back to the office and really put together that roadmap of expenditures. So a 30-year expenditure plan. Now that you know the costs that the association is going to incur, it's important to do the financial analysis. How are they going to offset those expenditures? So the first part is the reserve fund status. So the current reserve account balance is provided to the reserve specialist. That's essentially how much money the association has in reserves at the time the study is being completed. What are the current year reserve contributions? The reserve specialist will not recommend that you change the budget midstream. So we're going to incorporate what you've actually funded or are funding reserves for in the current year. We want to use a rate of return or interest. We are going to include interest earnings in the reserve study. And then we've just developed those planned reserve expenditures. So really what we're solving for in this equation is the future reserve contributions. The reserve specialist has outlined E, those expenditures. You've provided us the savings or the current reserve status, and then we're solving for R, those future reserve contributions. So here are some funding definitions. This also is taken right from CAI, from those National Reserve Study standards. They have sort of 4 main funding definitions. Fully funding means funding and attaining and maintaining reserves at or near 100% funded. This typically refers to the component method. For funding, I am going to go over that, but it is less commonly used. So I don't want to spend too much time on that. It is a pretty conservative method that we don't typically recommend. There's baseline funding, which is keeping reserves at or above 0, essentially not going into the red. You're trying to keep reserves as close to 0 as possible. There's threshold funding, and that funding goal is to keep reserves above a threshold, essentially. So that could either be a dollar amount or a percent amount. And depending on what threshold you utilize, it could be more or less conservative than full funding. Most reserve study specialists do utilize a threshold funding method, and that's what we use as well. And I can walk through that as well with the cash flow example that we're going to show. The last type of funding goal is a statutory funding. So that's really setting aside the specific minimum amount of reserves required by statutes. So as Alan mentioned, FHA requires 10% of the budget, and Maryland also is considering for the state requiring statutory funding. And Prince George's County does right now as well. Their statutory funding refers to the reserve study. So whatever the reserve study says is needed, that becomes your statutory funding requirement. So the 2 main funding ways of computing funding are the component method and the cash flow method. The component method is rarely used in this area. For the most part, everyone pools reserves and uses the cash flow, but I did want to speak to the component method. This truly is the definition. So I think it's easiest to understand with an example. So I will walk through an example, but to quickly discuss the definition, we're calculating or finding the unfunded balance, which is the cost in today's dollars minus how much you have in reserves at that time. And then the reserve contribution equals the unfunded balance divided by the remaining useful life. And then you do that for every single individual component to come up with the total reserve contribution. So again, it's easier to see an example. Hopefully this isn't too small. If you're on your phone, I'm sure it's pretty tiny. But if you are on a screen, hopefully you can see it. And we will send the presentation over so that you can actually zoom in and view this in a larger format. But in this, we're keeping it really simple. We just have 5 components. In this first example, the roof has a useful life of 15 years, and we're saying there's 5 years of remaining life left. And we anticipated the cost in today's dollars to be $535,000. The association has segregated. They don't have one reserve account. They have these 5 various accounts. So they actually have a roof account, a painting account, a paving account, a pool finish account, and then a pool furniture account. So in their roof reserve account, they have $335,000. So the total cost is $535,000. They have $335,000 in the bank. So we're saying they still need to accumulate another $200,000 to fund this project. We're saying there's 5 years left. So you take the $200,000, divide it by 5 to come up with the required contribution of $40,000 per year. So over the next 5 years, they have to contribute $40,000 to ensure that they have the $535,000 when the project is to occur in 5 years. You have to do that for each single component. You then sum up all of those individual line item contributions to come up with a total contribution. This is pretty conservative because it's assuming that this is just earmarked for roofs and just for painting and just for paving. It's not one big pot of money. So you have to essentially fund for each individually and make sure that you're funding each element at 100%, as opposed to one big pot of money where you have time to kind of just fund these big projects and accumulate reserves again to ensure the whole balance stays positive. So it's pretty conservative in one way. But then in the other, your hands are really tied. This doesn't include inflation. So assuming the reserve specialist was able to nail it perfectly, it costs exactly $535,000. What if the roof fails at 4 years? You're underfunded. Or what if the $535,000 was perfect, but now there's inflation? We didn't take into account inflation. So maybe it's $600,000. So it's both conservative, it locks your money away, but then is also kind of stringent because it ties your money to these accounts. So this is a less commonly used. It's very rare that it is used, but still wanted to show it because it is something that we'll get asked about, the straight line or component method. So the more commonly used method is the cash flow method. So again, defining it here, but I'm going to show that same example and walk through the cash flow. So the main difference is the cash flow looks at the total combined expenditures calculated for each year. So we're not looking at it by component. Well, we are for the expenditure plan, but for the funding plan, we're looking at it by year. So how much are we spending in 2022? How much are we spending in 2025? And we're making sure that you're funded by year as opposed to by element. The goal of it is to simply offset the expenditures by the existing reserves and future contributions. There will be a threshold or critical year that's determined. So what is the year of biggest expenses where you're really draining that reserve account? That's ultimately what's going to drive the funding recommendation. And this method can utilize inflation and interest on reserves, which we highly recommend incorporating into the study. So again, this slide's pretty small unless you are on a computer, but this is using that same example of those 5 line items and those expenditures. And again, instead of just looking at it by element, we're looking at it by year. So we're totaling up the cost by year to see how much the association is spending by year, and then running this cash flow analysis. So the bar chart in the middle, there's the starting reserve balance. The green is the recommended reserve contributions. There's the interest that you're going to earn, the expenditures, and then we calculate the year-end balance, which becomes then the following year starting balance. So we go through this analysis and we're finding the critical year. In this instance, it is in 2025. We're making sure that the association is adequately funding for those roofs. And then by default, they're funding for all of the other years as well. I think this graph at the bottom here really helps the average homeowner understand the importance of reserves. In this example, the blue line is the reserve balance. The green bars are the reserve contributions, and the red bars are the expenditures by year. So assuming reserves didn't exist, you'd have these really large fluctuations in the budget to offset these expenditures. Excuse me, you'd have to have these essentially special assessments to fund these really large projects, and you'd have this variability in your budget. So the goal is to flatten those contributions and spread them out and evenly distribute them with just inflationary increases, which is what we're trying to do with the green bar. So without a reserve study done, it's understandable that the average homeowner would see that they have, in this association, this example, $400,000 approximately in reserves. They have everything appears in relatively good condition. They don't have any near-term expenditures. So why are we contributing to fund all of this money into this account if we don't have any expenditures? We're still contributing. We're not spending any money. What's going on? And it's really, you're ramping up, you're building up for these years in 2024 and 2025 with really large expenditures where you're essentially draining that reserve account, right? This is your critical year. This is what you've been saving and funding for, so that now when you need to replace the roofs, you don't have to special assess. You have the funds in place and you can pull them right from that reserve account. Then they're in years of growth mode again, right? There's years of substantial increases and no expenditures. And that's because, again, you're approaching another kind of critical year where you're then again draining that reserve account and back in building mode. So this is a great tool for annual meetings or to help explain the budget or the importance of reserves, how we really are trying to flatten those contributions so there's no surprises. So now that you've had a reserve study done, when and how should you update it? What governs updating? So industry standard is every 3 to 5 years. The Prince George's County new law does state that they need to have a reserve study completed every 5 years. Virginia's law is also every 5 years. So that's kind of become the area general rule of thumb is every 5 years, which I would agree with. I think that's a great timeline outside of any of these external or internal changes. So really the reason to update is to make sure that you're staying current, because things can change over time. And that's why 5 years is sort of a good general rule of thumb. But if there's been any large changes in cost, materials, or building products that are going to drastically change the way you're going to operate your community, it's a good idea to make sure that that's incorporated into the reserve study. So if it's a large ticket item, it might be worth updating ahead of time. Let's say it's the siding of the buildings. That could drastically change the funding recommendation. And you want to make sure that you capture that and get back on track as soon as possible. There could be some sort of environmental impact. A good example of that might be maybe a hailstorm comes through and damages quite a few of the roofs. And now you have brand new roofs. Maybe your balance is lower because you did have to pay for some of that out of pocket, but now a bunch of the roofs are now replaced and have their full useful life. You'd want to make sure that that gets reflected into the reserve study too, so you're not contributing to these roofs that have already essentially been replaced. So those are sort of external changes kind of beyond the association's control, but there could also be internal changes as well. So any changes in the common property, maybe the association decides to add a new tennis court or a new playground. You want to make sure that that gets factored into the reserve study. Maybe they've removed a gazebo. You don't want to continue to fund for something that no longer exists on the property. So you want to make sure that the inventory in the reserve study is accurate. Effective maintenance practices. Maybe the association got on a really aggressive pavement maintenance plan and they really wrap their heads around it and they're spending substantial money repairing those streets that will affect the useful life, that we are anticipating a longer useful life. That would be helpful to incorporate into the reserve study, get your plan back on track to reflect how the association is currently operating. Or it could even be actual implementation of the original study. So maybe when you had that kickoff meeting, there were certain elements that you decided you'd want to fund through reserves, things, let's say, for example, maybe the pool mechanical equipment. But as a pump has failed or a filtration system needs to be replaced, you've actually been funding those through general maintenance and operating. Well, now the association's sort of funding for them in two places because you're contributing to the reserve account for them, but you're actually paying for them out of the operating budget. So you do want to make sure that you are aligning the reserve study with how the association actually is operating and functioning. So general rule of thumb, 5 years, but if there have been any of these substantial changes, that might warrant updating earlier. So what are the primary goals of the reserve study? First and foremost, to help assist with annual budget planning, right? To help set your assessments, to help decide how much you are going to contribute to that reserve account. It will really help with the planning. It helps associations make business decisions and inform the homeowners and prepare So before reserve studies were provided, let's say in the rest of Maryland where they aren't required, if you have a reserve study done and the board elects not to follow the reserve recommendations, at least you can inform the homeowners what it's going to cost to maintain the property. So if you're not funding reserves, homeowners can be informed that they need to be prepared for either a special assessment, that you're going to have to finance these capital projects and take out a bank loan, or worst case scenario, deferring these capital projects. So it really helps you plan whether you fund reserves or not. It helps you plan and operate like a business and prepare all of the owners for these upcoming costs that they're going to incur. It also helps you plan for capital projects. So it's a relatively new community and you don't have a lot of near-term expenditures. Maybe you want to allocate more of your money towards CDs where you can get a slightly higher interest rate as opposed to keeping it in more of a liquid savings account. It'll help you coordinate operating expenditures with capital expenditures. Maybe next year you have a capital project to paint the mile of perimeter fence. You'd want to make sure that you do that before you do your spring landscaping right in front of the fence, right? You want to make sure you're coordinating these capital projects with the routine operating and maintenance projects that you do. And then it'll also help you use as a benchmark for these projects when you go to tackle them. So maybe you are repaving the streets and you're unsure, do we need to totally replace? Should we mill and overlay? Should we overlay? It'll help you kind of compare your options. What was the reserve professional recommending versus what are these bids for? So it'll give you that independent recommendation on the best way to tackle these projects. And so in summary, the benefits of the reserve study, it will protect the board from claims of mismanagement. The board does have a liability, and this will help protect the board. The ease of budgeting, it'll help set accurate fees and plan for these large projects. It'll provide benchmarks for those projects that we just recommended or mentioned. It provides an expert opinion from an objective third party. So the person preparing your reserve study is not the person that's trying to replace that retaining wall or replace the roofs. It truly is an independent opinion on when this project needs to occur. Ideally, it'll help prevent special assessments if you are funding reserves properly. When you have a plan in place and you're following it, it will help. I think it helps boards be able to tackle these projects when they know what's on the horizon. If they have a plan to follow, it's a little bit easier to start tackling these projects. And as you are tackling these projects, by default, you're preserving the appearance of your community, right? You're keeping up with the appearance. It makes it easier to sell units and increases market value of those units. It just really contributes to maintaining the association and keeping it in excellent condition. That will also reduce the cost of maintaining the property. If the community is aging and you don't have a plan in place and you're not really sure what costs are in the horizon and the roofs are starting to fail, you're more likely to kind of continue to band-aid and repair them and spend a ton of money on these maintenance type costs, when in actuality, it might be time just to replace them. You're wasting money doing these repairs when they just need to be completely replaced, right? So by having that plan, it should help reduce some of those maintenance costs so you can proactively perform these projects. And then lastly, it's the fair and right thing to do. If I live in an association and I'm utilizing that pool, I should be contributing to the wear and tear and maintenance of it. So any homeowner that's actively living in association and utilizing all of these things, whether it's pavement or even an entrance monument, you should be contributing to the maintenance of it as well. So for the average homeowner, how do you use your reserve study? So it's personal financial planning. Again, if the association elects not to fund reserves in the way that the study recommends, you can personally plan your finances accordingly. Be prepared, have your own savings or reserve account for those special assessments, or know that they're coming. It'll help you distribute to potential buyers. Buyers are becoming much more savvy. We have real estate agents calling us all the time for a buyer that wants to buy a unit, but they want to see a copy of the reserve study. Rest assured, we won't release it to a realtor. We have to go through management and the board, but buyers are becoming much more savvy and wanting to see that associations are properly funding reserves. And then lastly, it'll help the homeowner understand the board decisions. I really think that graph is a great tool for that. helps homeowners understand the importance of reserves, what that money is going towards, why it's needed, and ultimately create buy-in with the homeowners and the board in kind of unity. So that's a summary on reserves and the importance of them and conducting a study. And with that, I will kick it over to Kim.
Okay, can you hear me? All right, so we've got 26 questions already loaded up. I'm going to try to bring in the rear here as quickly as possible so that we do have time to address the questions. So I'm going to address solving funding gaps through lending and what the elements of the loan process are, what guidelines are that are generally used, what the board and the manager can expect and in the way of forms that'll be requested, what the costs might be, questions to ask, and red flags to watch out for, and generally how long it will take. So next slide, please. So just the basics. With a community association loan, we are lending to the association as a legal entity. This is not a loan that will involve personal guarantees from board members in any way, shape, or form. It will not involve liens on the individual homeowners' units. So it is truly to the association, and the documentation is going to follow that suit. And as a community association, I would highly recommend that you seek a lender who is a CAI member, an educated business partner, because the corner bank, while they may want to help the community that they may be adjacent to, may not understand what the collateral is for a loan and may be asking for the wrong things. And you could find that you spend a lot of time with a bank that actually isn't necessary because they're not familiar with that lending process. So next slide, please. So what do we ask for? Because the elements of this loan are the association, we will ask for governing documents. The property is the association's common elements. So we'll want to understand what those are and how far do they reach into the community so that we know what's there. The association documents, as far as their financials, will be necessary because we measure cash flow and ability to repay debt. And then the project itself needs to be defined. And Ellen has identified several of the reasons why we ask for these things. And I'll speak of that more as well. Next slide, please. So with regard to the property and the borrower, with the community association, in the conversations that I usually have or a lender has with the manager or the board, we come to understand how many units are in the complex, what are the common elements. A lot of times the project that is being pursued for a loan it directly relates to what are and are not the common elements. So we get a picture of the neighborhood and the community. I also, and other lenders do this as well, research what the market value is of the units. I use Zillow.com, Realtor.com, all those online sources. That used to be something we would ask the manager. And fortunately now, because we have better outlets that are more easily accessed, it's less of a burden to the manager to have to provide some of those information items. So essential contacts will be important to us. We want to know who your attorney is, the manager of the association, how long have they been your manager? Sometimes there are transitions with management companies, and that can make it harder sometimes to get the financials when they weren't there before. And there's just aspects of it that we have to work through. It's neither good nor bad. It's just an aspect of what we need to understand. And then the list of the board of directors, because that may be a contact point for us. And then we ask for a list of unit owners, generally their address, their mailing address, and their assessment amount. Understand that when you're asked for that, it's not because the bank is going to market to those individuals. That isn't what the information is for. And a lender should provide you a privacy policy And we do that in our process. The purpose of gleaning that information is to understand what the owner occupancy level is, and if there are high concentrations of ownership. I have looked at community associations where there's 100 units, and a particular individual owned 14 of that 100 units, which meant because that person was delinquent, they had a 14% delinquency ratio just because of one person's event. So those are the aspects of what those materials are used for. Next slide, please. So from a financial standpoint, we are going to ask for the current year budget, and we will ask for the year-end financials, which would be the income and expense report and the balance sheet, and the year-to-date income expense report and balance sheet as well. An aging delinquency report reflects a 30, 60, 90-day aging of any accounts that are past due. And I'll explain that a little bit more in another slide, because we do have underwriting guidelines with regard to the quantity of delinquencies that are acceptable and which ones become worrisome. And then we look for 2 years of CPA prepared or management prepared financials. A lot of times the need for a CPA prepared financial is going to be driven by the amount of loan that is sought. And then of course we look at the reserve study, which is a common thread because it sort of becomes the beating heart of planning for everything. It helps understand for us whether the association's got enough money now, as well as are they going to have enough money through the life of the loan? And are there other projects pending that need to be paid attention to so that the community doesn't fall off a cliff between the loan and future projects? Next slide, please. So the governing documents will consist of the bylaws. If the community association is incorporated, we'll want to see the articles of incorporation, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, all the declarations, rules, and regulations will all be supplied to us. And in particular, we will ask for board minutes from recent meetings, because we will want to see that the discussion of a project and the need for the money has been an open discussion, memorialized in the board minutes, that the community is aware that these conversations are ongoing. Before the loan closes, we need to make sure, because some communities, and we encourage this, that they're going to get a unit owner vote. Now, sometimes depending on the amount borrowed and whether it impacts assessments, your governing documents won't necessarily require that. But we will often refer the manager to counsel and to those documents to ensure that they're proceeding within their rights in obtaining a loan. And then we ask for a copy of the insurance certificate because if there is any disaster, we want to know that the association is insured. So all of these documents will help us to determine that the board is eligible to pledge the assessments as collateral and their right to increase assessments as necessary to make the loan payment, and any other ongoing issues for the association above and beyond the loan or the project itself. Next slide, please. So the capital improvement project, I already mentioned in the minutes that we will want to see that there was some discussion of what the loan proceeds are to be used for. We'll have a conversation with the manager or the board to understand the full scope of the project. And oftentimes in tandem with considering a loan, either it's already been obtained an engineering report and contractors bids, or those activities are going on adjacent to seeking or initiating a discussion with a lender. You don't have to have all the contractors bids in and the engineering report finalized while we discuss a loan, but it is wise to have all of that done before you close on the loan. I have had situations where a loan commitment was issued for $1 million, and then the bids came in and the engineer report was finalized and 2 million was needed instead of 1 million. Now, the lender will regroup and they can roll with that. The good news was we hadn't closed on the loan already and then found out that they were $1 million shy of the intended project. So these are the things that we do want to see and encourage everybody to have wrapped up before they get to the closing. Next slide, please. So the underwriting criteria, what are we looking for in all these documents? First is the ability to pay for the debt. And what we will do is analyze the income that's available to the association. So we look at the assessment income, reserves, as well as any potential that the board or the manager are planning with a future budget for increasing assessments to better address the loan. It can be on the operating budget as a loan payment line item, or it is something that we will anticipate coming from reserves. But the important measurement that we're looking for is 1.15 times the loan amount in the way of cash flow. So if the loan payment is $100,000 a year, we want to see that the association is going to be receiving $115,000 in cash that is available for that loan payment. You're only going to pay us the $100,000, but the $15,000 generally goes to reserves. And it's important because things happen like pandemics. If your delinquencies ratchet up because of an unanticipated situation, that $15,000 is expected to be a buffer to help sustain the community. So that's the debt service coverage. Oftentimes it's, back it up. Yeah, oftentimes it's just referred to as DSC. And that's just banker terminology. Don't get hung up on that. It's pretty simple. It's just the amount of cash we want to see coming in. Reserves, we do want to see there's a pattern for a 10% of the gross annual income having gone historically to reserves as well as after the loan. Oftentimes it's much more. That's on the manager and the board, but we do use that as a bit of a paradigm for a best practice that could change with time, but that's where we are right now. Next slide, please. All right, so delinquencies. So I'd mentioned before an aging delinquency report that will reflect a pattern of 30, 60, 90, or 120-day late measurements for each of the unit owners that might be late. One thing that I want to mention is that the delinquency report should not include past owners. It doesn't mean you can't collect money from them. That's not why I say that. But as a banker, we're going to want to see no more than 10% of total units 60 days or more late. So if there's 100 units, 10 is our cap. Or 10%, and both are measured. So you might make one measurement, but not the other. So the other measurement is no more than 10% of the gross assessment income annually being 60 days or more delinquent. So if you collect $1 million a year, you've got $100,000 tolerance for delinquencies in assessment income. Another point I want to make is that lenders may measure that a little bit differently. Understand it. If you have delinquencies that you are concerned with, the lender should work with you on fleshing out what do you really have in the way of delinquencies. If there are past owners in that report, identify them so that they get taken off and are not included in that measurement. Other things that we don't always measure, I don't care about late fees, attorney's fees. Sorry, Ellen. No late fees, no attorney's fees, no service fees, no work orders, no past special assessments. That's not being counted. So take that and use that going forward. And a lender should work with you if your delinquencies are concerned. I spend quite a bit of time and have historically with managers to really flesh those out to understand what we really are working with here. Owner occupancy, we like already was mentioned, 51% or more we want to see as owner occupants. If it is a Ocean City community, seasonal occupancy is different. There are times where this is a guideline. It's not a hard and fast rule. So if we're at 50, or excuse me, we're at 45%, but there's no delinquencies in the community. They're financially sound, their reserves are good. They just, you know, had a surprise with a road erosion project that they didn't anticipate, and they got to fix the sinkhole in the parking lot. I mean, those are things that we work through with the community. But the general rule is 51% or more owner occupied. And then the reserve study is going to be looked at because we're going to want to analyze what else is going on in that community after the loan is granted. So I'm going to ask you to go to the next slide because I have an illustration of how that works, please. All right, so I hope you can see this. You'll notice in 2018, this is an old slide, that there is a $500,000 roof project. And what's happened is the community has moved that project forward. It was originally planned for 2021 and 2022. And since the costs in those 2 years included both flat roofs and the shingles, we've moved that forward. It's $500,000. And down toward the bottom of the financial statement, you'll see the loan proceeds have been entered there as available cash, along with the contribution to reserves, which continues. You can see the contribution to reserves is a flat amount that goes across the bottom. And then the loan payment is plugged in as taking money away from reserves in order to make the payment. In looking at that loan payment, you'll see in the first year, the loan payment is $22,500. In the second year, it's $84,800. That is a signal that in the first year, this community is getting a line of credit and they're paying interest only on that debt during that line of credit period. And the amount borrowed is going to ramp up as the project progresses. So in the second year, because they're paying principal and interest, the loan payment has gone up, and that is a static number then for the remaining duration of that loan across the board. But you'll notice we're in good shape as a community here up until we get to the year 2024. And surprise, we have a balcony repair project coming up, and we have a pavement project that's going to be quite a big chunk of change. And with the loan payment being static and the reserves not increasing, they don't have sufficient money. They're in a negative cash flow in the first year of $65,000. So this is when, as a lender, if I'm doing a loan commitment letter, I'm going to need to call the manager or the board and have a discussion about how will you address this? Will you be postponing those repairs? Is my assumption that reserves will not increase incorrect? And do I need to adjust that because you guys are going to raise assessments? So those are some of the examples of what will be important to us in working on the cash flow aspect of your reserve study. Next slide, please. Oh, we have a poll. Thank you. We're just making sure everybody's still with us. So if you left the room, come back. We need you to answer the poll that you are here, and which state is the webinar focused. And I guess I have to answer mine too. No, all right. Okay, so I'm gonna go on. So what questions do you need to ask your lender? So I've just told you everything that I'm gonna look at as a lender, and most lenders will look at. But what do you need to know, because you're not a lender, that you should look out for? So not all banks charge the same fees. We charge a closing cost because we involve an attorney depending on the loan product, and that will be an attorney in Maryland who, like Ellen, is versed in the documentation. We make sure that our documents are enforceable in the state of Maryland. And there might be some back and forth with the community's counsel on the content of those documents. Some of our loan products don't afford that option. So it does depend, and your loan programs will be different. There are quick term loans that are created, and those oftentimes are much more streamlined and don't involve counsel back and forth with each other. So that's one thing to consider. So closing costs are a fee. Origination fees are sometimes charged. That's an income to the bank. The other fees that come up are application fees, underwriting fees, and oftentimes if you have a line of credit, there might be a draw fee as those funds are being borrowed down. So those are all the things you're going to want to understand and flesh them out. Reserve funds on deposit with the lender. It is common. Banks right now want deposits. Uh-oh. Can you guys still see me? Because my screen just changed. Uh-oh.
We can
You're
see you.
good.
Yep.
You're
You
good.
can see me and hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, then I'm just going to go from my paper printed slides. I apologize. Let me catch up with myself. Sorry, folks. All right. So reserve funds, banks want deposits right now. And so banks will typically ask for some of your reserve funds. Some lenders are going to ask for all your reserve funds to be put on deposit with them. Some banks will require all the operating and reserve funds be on deposit with them. And then of late, because of COVID and payment situations, more institutions that used to lend without making requirements about depositing their funds with that bank some of them won't speak with you if you don't already have your operating and reserve accounts on deposit with them. So some of these things have changed. Be prepared, but there are variables about what will be requested. And so if some of the requests that you're being presented with aren't acceptable for legitimate, financial reasons, it's a hardship to the community, have that conversation with your lender. Open up, tell them that, especially if you'd really like to work with them. Let them know what about their program doesn't work for you. And then shop around. There are plenty of CAI approved lenders that not everybody's going to ask for the same thing. If the lender is asking you for a CD as collateral, this is a red flag. This is a lender who doesn't understand that the collateral for the loan is the assessments and the right for the board to increase them and impose assessments for the loan payment. And then prepayment penalties. Now, this is a very important point that can be costly at any time that you are in a loan transaction. The most common situation for a prepayment penalty is that if there is income from the association's own cash flow that causes them to prepay their debt, there will be no prepayment penalty. It is common to allow the association to prepay their debt from their own income and not be penalized. That's point number one. Then if you refinance your debt that you went into, let's say you got a loan with my bank and you're 5 years in and you've refinanced it with another bank, then it's common for there to be a prepayment penalty if you're refinancing debt through another bank. Most common, it would be a percentage of the outstanding balance at the time the loan is paid off. So if it's $1 million loan and there's a 1% prepayment penalty and the outstanding balance is now $500,000, 1% of $500,000 is a whole lot less than 1% of $1 million. So the most typical is the outstanding balance at the time of payoff. The next most punitive would be the outstanding balance at the time that the loan was created. And then the one that I really want everybody to be watchful or mindful of and to really watch out for, especially if the language is squishy. And if these two words are used, you need to get it fleshed out. If your prepayment penalty is described in any way to include yield maintenance, essentially yield maintenance means that you will pay that lender all the interest they would have earned on that loan had it gone the full duration. You will pay it to them at the time of payoff. And the only person that wins in that scenario is the bank. So please be careful. And also, if you run into that language and you want some tips about how to protect yourself against yield maintenance, then please reach out. The best thing to do is get an amortization schedule from your lender on your hypothetical loan. And once you have that amortization schedule, ask that lender to give you in writing the answer to the question of what would my prepayment penalty be in 5 years if I refinance this debt with another bank, and get it from them in writing so that you've protected yourself. Next slide, please. So what are the loan rates and term options most common? Line of credit is very common. A line of credit works like a home equity loan. You are underwritten for up to a certain amount. A lot of communities that might have money in reserves and have a project that they're anticipating, but they're afraid maybe it'll run over. A line of credit works really nicely because they can keep their reserves whole, let the project finish. They'll pay usually interest only during the line of credit period. And then when it's over, the line of credit has to be paid off. And if the reserves were sufficient, you're good and you protected yourself. Another common approach is a fixed term loan. Now, interest rates right now are low enough. You should be able to get a fixed interest rate on your line of credit and on your term loan. The term loan would be, for example, a roof project that's going to be $1 million, and you can sometimes get these within 30 days. There are quick term loans that are available from a lot of lenders, and that would then produce $1 million available to the community to finish their project. And 30 days after closing, they have a set payment amount that's predictable, and it runs the same amount month after month until the loan is paid off. So that's the easy product. And then there's also a combination of a line of credit with a fixed term loan. So the line of credit has to be paid off at its end. And so if we underwrite the line of credit with a fixed term loan at its end, then you can fund to pay off the line of credit. You can also generally use any reserve money you want to reduce that debt before you flip it to a fixed term loan. So we do encourage our communities to try to borrow as little as possible. Don't borrow less than what you need, because that can be painful too. But your fixed term loan will then take you out of that line of credit and convert you to your fixed rate for the remaining duration. So it's one or the other, or a combination of both. And with the line of credit, if you don't get a fixed rate, sometimes they fluctuate with prime. So it could be prime +1, it could be prime minus something, or it could just be prime. That's very common. And if you borrow more money than you need, the lender, this goes back to that provision that from the assets of the association itself, you are able to pay down the amount you borrow from your own assets without being penalized. So if you do get a term loan for $1 million, because you don't want to do the line of credit, you know the roof project's going to be done in 30 days or 60 days, you expect it's going to be $1 million. The project's over, you only needed 800, and you've got 100,000 in your reserves you want to put toward it. So take that money and pay down the principal balance. Pay it down, and then some lenders like mine, we will re-amortize the debt so that the payment amount is reduced, reducing the cash demand on the association for the remaining life of the loan. And we don't charge to do that re-amortization. So that is another aspect that you might want to be on the lookout for, is what if we borrow more than we need? Do we have options? And so next slide. So the time, this is very weird to do with not seeing the slides. So the time frame, can you still hear me?
Yep.
Okay, good, because I've totally lost the screen. All right, so the time frame to complete the process, if you get one of those quick term loans that are often out there, sometimes they can be done within 30 days. Now, with that approach, the board has to be ready to do what they want to do, and the manager has to be supplying information at the pace that would allow the bank to be able to respond that quickly. More commonly, I can do loan proposals can be done within 3 to 5 business days, most situations. And that's your starting point. And when you get a loan proposal, I really recommend, because managers aren't financial people, let the banker present the loan proposal and all of its important elements to the board and answer the questions, so that you're getting unfiltered answers back to the board and from the expert that's in the room. But the loan proposal should only take 3 to 5 business days. Once the board accepts that, generally you're looking at a 45 to 60 day time horizon to get to the settlement table and have the money available. It can run longer. If the community has to vote, that would be a situation where it might take 90 days. If you're coming into the holidays and things like that, it will take a little bit longer. But most lenders will happily work with you to reverse engineer that time horizon so that you can plan accordingly. Also, most lenders are going to be more than happy to talk with a manager or a board at the time of budget planning so that you can prepare the next year's budget. If it's a project for 2022, have the discussions in July or August, whenever your budget cycle is, with whatever lender you're thinking you might use. It doesn't mean you have to use them, but you can begin those discussions so that you can prepare what the assessment increase needs to be to adequately address the debt that you're considering entering into. So with that, hopefully I've answered most of your questions, but we will turn to Q&A, and I will try to recover my screen.
Okay, can everyone hear me? This is Ellen again. Michelle, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, I'll just start to begin with, but if both Kim and Michelle, if you'll both keep mics open, I think that might work to address some of the questions. Just sort of going in order, try to roll through some of them as best we can. Alfred had asked a question about the pending Maryland House Bill 313 and the minimum fund balance. Well, the House Bill 313, if it's paralleling Prince George's County, which it seems to at the moment, it is going to be pointing to the reserve study, and whatever your particular reserve study comes up with what is needed is what will be the minimum requirements. Cindy asked about whether bylaw changes approved by owners have to go to a state entity for approval or some other processes. What I believe she's asking is, once you have a bylaw amendment, if you are in an association and it's gone through the appropriate process with the owner vote, in order for it to be effective, you're going to have to file the bylaw amendment in the Homeowners Association depository. If you are in a condominium and you've done a bylaw amendment, that is going to have to be recorded in land records to be effective. Calissa has asked whether the statement that the reserves shall be the funding amount by the most recent completed reserve study means that they have to be fully funded, even if it means a special assessment or a significant increase in the fees. The short answer, from what it appears, based upon the code in Prince George's County and what's likely to come through, is that yes, it has to be fully funded, but the Prince George's County Code and the draft bill from the Maryland state provides that the board will have the power to do a special assessment. So it's not going to be a homeowner vote, it's board power. And that's how it's going to be funded based upon that reserve study again. Stephen asked about and stated our HOA has a substantial reserve. When is it appropriate to use these reserves? That's a rather broad question and a broad answer because it depends. Substantial reserve, well, is that sufficient? Is that going to be sufficient in far as what may be coming with respect to the laws? And then as far as the use, you've got to take a look at the condition of your community. I would address that with your manager. I'm just going through these questions kind of in order.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the main thing is that it is an association maintained element, that it's above that threshold cost, that it is a capital cost, but not a capital improvement. You can't use it. Let's say you wanted to add a new playground. You should not be using reserves to install something new. It is repair and replacement for the common elements that the association is responsible for. But like Ellen said, substantial is really hard to determine without understanding your future needs. And the best way to do that really is with a reserve study.
Great, great. Javier asked if reserve items are replaced over longer periods of time, example 20 years, would the funds to cover be reduced to 25%? That sounds like a question for Michelle.
Yeah, I can take that one. So I think the thought or question on this is like, if you're not replacing a roof for 20 years, do you need the full amount of the roof or cost today? And if that is the question, the answer is no. Ideally, you're contributing periodic on an annual basis, smaller amounts. So within that 20-year time frame comes, you are then fully funded. So you have the money to fund that project. But it is a gradual contribution. So you're looking at all the expenditures by year and making sure that you're funded by year for all those various costs that the association is going to incur.
Okay. Leonard has a question for his specific community. And I would suggest for Leonard to go ahead and send your particular email question to your management company, the Kim or Michelle or myself directly, just so that we're not getting too specific, because there may be a lot of information, and certainly we don't want to be giving, well, for me, I'll say legal advice without having all the facts. And there's obviously a lot involved with that question. Isha had asked about whether the new laws affect DC and Maryland condos and HOAs. I cannot speak to District of Columbia, but if the state law, the House Bill 313 addresses, it actually does cover condominiums, homeowners associations, and our little quiet general friend, the cooperatives. So it is effective, or will be, or might be, all depending on what the legislature does with all three types of communities.
And I don't think there is anything in DC. I haven't heard of anything
Nothing
on the horizon.
Okay, thank you. Good to know. Lynn asked about, does the current law require 10% funding? Lynn, if you were referencing the FHA and that aspect, yes, the FHA does require that 10% funding to reserves for budgets, but the new laws are dealing with the fully funded based upon the reserve study. But if you need clarification a little more, you know how to reach me, certainly. Ruth asked about what is the penalty for non-compliance as stated in the bills. The bills themselves don't reference any non-compliance issues. So it doesn't reference, say, a criminal matter or a civil matter, except as with any type of code, if it is adopted and made law, what you have then is, and it brings us back to the beginning where I was talking about your fiduciary duty, that law would be the duty of the board to assure that that particular community is fully funded and has done the reserves every 5 years. So your non-compliance issues might be a lawsuit for a breach of complying with what may become the new Maryland law, or you may be dealing with the Attorney General's office if an owner addresses that matter as well, depending which avenue the owner may have an issue with what's going on. Clayton, and again, I'm just going in order. Clayton asked about, are you making a distinction between reserves for operational expenses versus capital repair replacement?
Yeah, I can take this one. So
Excellent.
sometimes the reserve study typically focuses on the capital repair and replacement. And sometimes associations will elect to have an operating reserve. It's more of a contingency account. So if you go over on maybe landscaping or snow removal, it's sort of like a rainy day fund. If the association elects to have that, that is separate from the capital reserve study. So you would not need a study on that because it is more of a contingency discretionary account that that association has elected to maintain. So this is the reserve study, and the law is focused on the capital repair and replacements.
Excellent. Richard asked about, can the board make additional contributions to the reserves at the end of their fiscal year if they have already fully funded their reserves and have excess monies left over from their operating budget? That's a question, Richard, I would raise specifically to your management company as well as your legal counsel. Generally, if you do have money, you may be able to do what you're suggesting, but you might have some limitations perhaps in your documents. The board might need to do particular approvals, and certainly your management company and counsel can specifically give you your answer for your specific community and situation. Susan asked about, our HOA has both public and private streets. Should private street repaving or resurfacing be tied to the public schedule for the same on public streets? Michelle, do you have thoughts on that? I mean, certainly I could address, but.
Yeah, so I think it's hard to predict the public schedule. DOT or the local municipality might not provide that. They might not even have a plan for those public streets. So it might be hard to tie them together. What I would say is that the board is responsible for those private streets. So it's the association, or I should say the board, the association is responsible for that. So it's in the association's best interest to maintain their private streets to the best of their ability outside of what the public does. Now, if you do hear that they are doing their streets and maybe you can negotiate a good deal to do them at the same time, that's something to consider. But I wouldn't plan on just tying your private street maintenance with the public street maintenance.
And to follow up with that, as to what Michelle said, even if you were presented a perfect, predictable, this is what the county is going to do with respect to its streets, that might be a starting point, but you would then have questions about, well, what's your usage of your streets versus the public streets? What's a different type of materials? Do you jet seal your asphalt such that you might actually have a longer life? And so there's a lot of components that ultimately, while the county for a lot of things can be a really good start, you need to dig in and further analyze.
Great point.
David asked, if a large maintenance item occurs that is not included in the existing reserve study, may this item be funded by this study? And if yes, how does this repayment occur? Michelle?
So if an item for some reason wasn't included and it is association's responsibility, you might have to check with your manager and possibly attorney to see, or accountant, to see if you truly can fund that project out of the reserves. And if you are able to fund it out of reserves, you should update your reserve study very quickly if it's a large cost to make sure that you get your funding back on track and that you're properly planning now for that element moving forward as well.
Right. In respect to the repayment, if it can't be handled by the reserve, you may have a couple ways to do it. If it's a small, say $2,000 aspect, maybe you have some underage for the budget for that year. Obviously, it's the big numbers that become more problematic, and that you would have to take a look at how much it is, Could it be put into next year's? Or is it the type you might have to really do a special assessment this year? And again, that would be, you need to go back to your documents, talk to management, and perhaps even include legal counsel on that aspect. Carol asked, the Maryland legislature may pass legislation requiring a condo association to fund reserves at 80% based on the study, but 80% of what? Shouldn't an association be cautious what is listed on the reserve study, i.e. do not put wishful thinking project in the reserve study? Thoughts? And yes, Carol, I had that sort of along the same line question for Michelle, is now that if the state is going to point to the reserve study, well, which is it? What reserve study premise is going to count? Is it the threshold? Is it the straight line? And that goes to this 80%, and what cautious might go into the reserve study. So that's a good one for Michelle too.
Yeah, and that's a good one. And I would say that's something that you would want to work with your provider to make sure that they are providing the funding method that aligns with how you actually fund reserves. So if you are in a cash flow scenario where you have one big reserve account, you should not have the component method funding analysis included in your study. You want to focus on the cash flow and that recommendation to be reflective of how you operate. Most providers will not want to bring you right down to zero. It's pretty typical to have a threshold, and the threshold really will vary. This is where I say it's sometimes more of an art than a science, based on the expenditures you have around that. So if it's a 1 year with a really, really large cost and not a ton of expenditures around, maybe that threshold can come down slightly. The goal of that threshold is really to avoid shortfalls and make sure that you are properly funded. And it is, we don't want to be overly conservative, but we don't want that shortfall. So that's where it sort of becomes more of an art. And I would recommend that you work with that reserve specialist to make sure that it's reflective of how you operate. Almost all providers will provide a revision period. So they'll provide a preliminary report, and then you have X amount of time. Personally, we allow 6 months to notify us of any requested revisions, so we can go back, kind of tweak things and work through that with you to make sure that it's something reasonable on how you want to fund moving forward. A lot of providers also now will provide Excel. So during that revision period, you will actually have the Excel file to kind of toy with the numbers, play with the numbers, and see what's feasible and what makes sense for you.
Great. And Michelle, you're still on. Kelly asked, in Maryland, how much does a reserve study and evaluation cost for a small community? Is there a general range?
Yeah, and that's a good question. Reserve studies are, the cost is really determined by the amount of time it'll take the engineer to prepare the study. So it will, vary. General rule of thumb, $2,000 to $5,000. More of a high-rise building, it might be more like $10,000. But if it's really small with just a monument and maybe a little bit of fence, more like $1,500, $2,000. So it will really vary based on the size, but general rule of thumb, I would say $2,000 to $5,000.
Richard has a question for you as well, Michelle. Can the condominium request that the reserve study be prepared using a flat contribution amount for each year of the study?
Usually not. When clients do ask that of us, we will include that in there as an alternate, but it wouldn't be our recommendation because we know things do cost you inflate over time, right? So if you're incorporating inflation in the expenditures, but not in the contributions, it's actually not fair to the current homeowners because we shouldn't be paying today the same amount, whether it's $100,000 or $400,000, as a homeowner will in 30 years, just due to the value of the dollar. So that's why it's not recommended. And most providers, I think, would not recommend it. But like I said, we can include that as an alternate if you wanted to see it.
Okay. Scott had a question, and I'm assuming this is the Scott that I know with respect to the condominium I know. So Scott, since it's a very particular question, why don't we take that one offline and you and I can talk this afternoon. Ralph has a question, it appears, for Michelle. What does fully funded mean for a cash flow based reserve study?
And so the fully funded definition applies more to the component when you're looking at each individual component in its own sort of analysis. But if you tried to apply that definition to the cash flow, it would essentially mean contributing at the level that that cash flow recommends. So at that recommended, if it's $100,000, contributing $100,000.
Okay, Gus has a question for Michelle. What is the difference again between the cash flow and component methods of reserve funding?
So cash flow assumes one big pot of money, and all the reserves are pooled together. You're funding out of, one account, as opposed to component, which assumes every individual line item or component on your property has its own reserve account. So if you had 60 line items, you'd have 60 different reserve accounts, where cash flow assumes one big general common reserve account.
Got it. Ted asked, how do you explain to owners when the reserved amount for an item, say a lobby renovation, is less than the contractor's bid for that item? Can you use other reserve funds to meet the higher cost and then provide additional assessment funds next year to replenish the reserves?
And so a reserve study is really a budgetary tool. So hopefully the costs are accurate, but if it is short, if the lobby renovation, for example, is more expensive than what was outlined, you can fund that whole project through the reserve account. It's just important, like you said, to kind of catch up. So you might want to update the reserve study to get the funding back on track, or come up with a plan to replenish reserves for that overage in expenditures.
Linda has a question for Kim. Is it common for banks to only lend to condos or HOA with 25 units or more? Does a bank have a minimum number of units you lend to?
In answer to the question, it is common for there to be a minimum number of units. That said, if you have a relationship with the bank already, oftentimes they'll overlook that minimum and work with you anyway. In my situation, our general guideline is 24 units or more. That said, we've done loans for communities that have fewer units than 24. And we've been around for over 20 years. So what happens is we have relationships with existing associations, and when they're smaller, we work with them. So I hope that helps. It will vary from lender to lender, and yes, there are some minimum guidelines.
Got it. Farah asked, is there any information about creating income while reserve is down? Also more information about overseeing the spending activities by the board. This is kind of a couple part question, but the way an entity, I'll say, creates income, of course, is to charge and levy assessments. Those are based upon, of course, what it is the community needs for any given year. You certainly can do, I'll say, little fundraising aspects that some communities attempt to do, but that has a tax ramification that you want to consider. And the way to increase a community's income is raise the assessments, but you've got to have a reasonable basis for that, of course. And about overseeing the spending activities, keep in mind, owners in any community, you have a right to see the books and records of the association. So you can take a look at the documents of the association, as long as they're not attorney-client privileged or, say, draft materials. Christopher has a question for Kim about, should a condominium establish a line of credit in advance as a form of security?
I think what you mean is, does the community want to establish a line of credit as a backstop in case their project and their reserves, the project overspends the reserves? So, because the line of credit isn't really security. So to get over that little detail, yes, it would be helpful for if you have a community going into a project that there is concern that your reserves will not fully fund the project, or you'd rather have that line of credit as a safety net, then yeah, it's a good idea to have that line of credit in place before the project starts. Hopefully I've answered your question.
Letitia asked, is there a recommended software program that can be utilized for reserved calculations?
There are definitely softwares on the market. The one thing I will caution with those is the physical valuation can't be performed from those software. So you have to have your arms around the cost of the components, the remaining useful life, the quantities. You have to come up with all of that information on your own. Or there are providers that provide software with the reserve studies. Like personally, we do offer a software after we prepare the reserve study. You can purchase and subscribe to the software to keep your reserve study current. But I would caution you preparing a reserve study from the software companies unless you have a background in preparing reserve studies.
Good point, good point. Jewel has a question, and I believe this would be for Kim. Oh, just got a different one in. Is there collateral required from an HOA? If there is a severe downturn in the economy, assessments payments fall, and the loan can't be repaid, what happens? Also, are all board member signatures required to accept the loan?
I think I know Jewel. Hi. So the collateral for the loan is the assessments and the board's right to impose assessments and increase them. So that is the collateral. And yes, it is required. When the loan is closed, we will file a UCC financing statement, which stands for Universal Commercial Code. And that just makes a public record that as a bank, we have an interest in the assessments, in the income of that association. If there is a severe downturn in the economy, like a pandemic, earlier I'd mentioned that we want to see 1.15 times the payment amount coming into the association. It is, in a time like this, also may be advisable, again, based on your governing documents, based on the direction of your attorneys, to increase any allowance for bad debts you may have budgeted for. And again, get the advice of counsel on that front and make sure your documents allow. Now, I can tell you that for over 20 years, the bank that I work for has been in this business, and my president has been involved from the beginning, and we've never had a loan go into default. So the mechanisms that are in place for the board to impose assessments and take action on delinquencies, as long as everybody is vigilant, this has not typically been a problem. Now, the past is not always a promise for the future, but it should give you some level of comfort that it is highly irregular for it to become that bad if you're being vigilant in your collections. All board members do not have to sign the documents. In our case, now that again may change from bank to bank. Often there is one or two forms that all the board members sign, but generally the preponderance of forms are signed by the president and the treasurer. I'm not sure the basis for the concern around that, but you know how to reach me, and I can help with that on an individual basis. And then, okay, so if for some reason the bank finds that the association is not in conformance with the covenants of the loan, covenants are the delinquency ratio, the debt service coverage ratio. We measure those year over year for the associations depending on the loan amount. If for some reason a community fails to continue to meet that measurement, there are curative periods of time provided for. So your lender should be in regular contact with you if that should become the case, to work those things out. The worst thing that'll happen is that the lender will take over the association, rest assured, we don't want to do that. So there are interim steps, and nothing would happen lickety split. It would be a situation that would be a process. I hope that helps.
Sounds good. Paul had a question. Are you saying the reserve studies will dictate condos annual budget if the Maryland minimum law is enacted, irrespective of the board and unit owner's decision? Or does your last comment about board having the ability to dictate a special assessment without a vote, irrespective of the bylaws, cover this? Try to go back to it. The reserve study law that may come into effect for the state of Maryland, again, it points to the reserve study as if the reserve study says next year you need 100,000, then that community will need $100,000 next year in its reserves to be in compliance with the law. So the reserve study, of course, again, the fund and what goes into it, that is part of your budget. So the overall budget is not determined, but that portion of the budget would be assessed. And the second part, yes, at least the proposed law for Maryland and the actual existing current law for Prince George's County does provide the board and the board alone with the ability to do a special assessment itself. It doesn't need to go to the community. It's in order to comply with the reserve study funding, the board has to come up and the board has the power to levy a special assessment to get that fund up to where it has to be to comply with the law.
I think it's important to mention here too, that most reserve study providers will not say, shame on you for not contributing before. Ideally, you'd have X amount in the bank right now, so you need to special assess. It really is a forward-looking process. So, how much money you have in the reserves today will absolutely influence how much you need to contribute in the future. But it usually is more, and this kind of ties with another question about associations being underfunded and owners with moderate incomes. Are there timeframes to get to adequate funding? Most reserve study providers will work to kind of phase in or ramp up those contributions, assuming you have time to do so. If you need to replace all of your roofs next year, there's really not much time to build up. But say you have another 5 years left, most providers will kind of work with you to ramp up or phase those increases over that 5-year period to give you time to build reserves and inform homeowners of this change and that these increases are coming, and so that they can plan accordingly. Our general rule of thumb is about 5 years. You really don't want to stretch out these increases much longer than that, but that will at least buy some time to allow associations to build up that reserve account.
Points. And Donna asked, I believe Michelle could certainly answer this, I think. If you want to build something new, what funds would you use for that if you cannot use reserve funds?
Yeah, you really can pull from reserves to add a new pool or a new component. Some associations do have like a capital improvement account. I've seen that where they want that earmarked for these sort of projects, and they do not have that money included in the reserve study. Sometimes it's kind of built into the documents when a homeowner buys a lot or there's a transaction of a property. Sometimes they'll have to contribute to this capital improvement account, and it's meant for things like additions and improvements. If that doesn't exist, you could also special assess, but that the funds really are for elements that already exist. So when you do construct that new element, then you want to work it into the reserve study, but the initial installation should not come out of reserves.
All right.
And I can toss in on that. I have had a lot of loan activity in either acquisition of common elements or new common elements. And that is a common purpose for seeking a loan. Generally involves a vote for the entire community. Again, governing documents and direction of council would be advisable. And your governing documents may dictate that it has to be paid for via a special assessment and cannot be through an increase of current assessments because you're not repairing an existing element. So it does happen, and often if it does happen, it's because of the desire to improve values in the community, because competing neighborhoods now have gym facilities, or they have a bigger pool, or they have a pool house, etc.
Excellent. And Leslie asked about when would the House Bill 313 possibly pass and become law? Well, I believe currently they are taking comments on House Bill 313 as we sit here today. I believe one of the readings may be, I think it was February 18th, but if it gets passed and ultimately becomes a bill, I don't believe it's slated for an emergency bill. And typically, although not always, the bills, if they pass and they become law, October 1st of 2021 is generally the time frame, and I do believe that's what's stated in the House Bill 313. That's pretty standard for most legislation in Maryland. Faith asked, are we required to have an outside company do a reserve study, or can we do our own study? What do you think, Michelle?
The bill for Prince George's County is very specific that you have to have prepared reserve studies, and I think it's like 30, or you have to have a background in engineering or construction. There's all these stipulations that really, this has to be something you do. The average board wouldn't be able to prepare their own reserve study under the bill. Outside of that, it is still best practice to have it done professionally by an independent third party. We aren't biased to when you'll need to do these projects. It is very matter of fact when it's an independent third party. And we don't have any, if you're a homeowner trying to do your own study, you're probably relying on your vendors, the people that are going to be replacing your roofs. Do you want them providing the useful life and the costs? Probably not. It's probably, in your best interest to have an independent third party prepare the reserve study.
Certainly agreed with Michelle. And that goes back to, are you complying with your fiduciary duty, and having that independent third party professional make that assessment, who's got the ability, has the background, that would be the appropriate reliance. Susan asked, can a reserve study be paid for out of reserves?
Yes.
There you go. Susan also asked, are trees a huge asset in our community ever included in reserve studies?
Also, yes. So that is something that's it is more of a contingency line item. A reserve specialist can't predict when there's going to be a drought or a disease that's going to come through, or even heavy winds, right? So that is something that usually boards will look historically, what have they spent, or work with an arborist or their landscaping maintenance company to plan for a budgetary number moving forward. And it truly is a contingency. So an association might tell us we want to budget $30,000 every 5 years. So that's something that would be factored into the reserve study as a contingency or sort of placeholder for those unanticipated sort of tree large capital project expenditures.
Got it. Rosemary asked a question about, I live in an aging HOA and the board removed the playground and closed the tennis court, which is in need of repair. Do we use the reserve to replace these amenities? Can the money come out of reserves to replace and repair? Is the board responsible to replace these amenities? Quite a few questions. I don't know if Michelle, you want to tackle some of the pieces?
Sure. Yeah. So if you live in an HOA and the playground and tennis courts are being demolished and removed, that is essentially taking care of it or maintaining getting rid of the safety hazard. So that project can be funded out of reserves to remove it and demo it. As far as replacing it with something different, if you maybe had a tennis court and now you're going to install like a dog park or something, that does get a little bit dicier. You'll have to review your legal documents and probably work with your attorney and accountant to determine legally what you can do to start switching amenities and how you need to fund those. So that is something that we can incorporate into the reserve study. We're actually working with a client right now on something very similar, but they are working with their attorney and their accountant to develop exactly what they're going to do and what they legally can, and then that will get incorporated into the reserve study accordingly.
Got it. Lynn is asking, Michelle, is it better Is it a better practice to have a lump sum in reserves rather than separate line items on a budget, not as restrictive on using the funds, ? Cash flow versus component, ? Yes, ?
Yes, yes, it is. It's much better to have one lump sum of reserves and utilize the cash flow method, because it does allow for changes and variation. This is a reserve study is a budgetary tool, and you want to have that flexibility to have one account as opposed to tying money up for these individual components. It's much tougher to manage and becomes pretty restrictive too. So you are better off having the cash flow method with one big reserve account. I do need to kind of caution that, because we haven't really clarified it yet. There are some times where, using that example, when someone asked about private versus public streets, sometimes associations will have two reserve accounts, one for general common expenditures, and then one for maybe the private streets, where only the homes on those private streets pay into that account. So that is slightly different, where that is two established reserve accounts that would both utilize the cash flow. So we'd still say have one big lump sum of money for these different sort of entities that are responsible for different things.
Got it. Ted asked, is there Maryland law that restricts the investment vehicles that a condo association can use to invest its reserve funds? I am told we only invest in government-backed securities like treasuries or CDs. Ted, there's no particular Maryland law that states for the condos or HOAs that states thou shall not invest in and fills in the blank. What you're addressing is the conservative, appropriately conservative, I might add, that you are, as a board member, as a manager, you are dealing with other people's monies, not only for a given year, but also the big money that sits in the reserve accounts. And it is one thing to have it not increase over 5%, 10%. It's not your job as a financial planner to make more money for that. You are to preserve and protect all those funds. And that is why with all those overriding issues, I'm assuming it's your management company and or your legal counsel that's saying, if you're going to try to put funds in accounts, that they are going to be very, very safe and very secure, such as your government-backed securities and CDs. It's just a safe way to invest. You're still investing, but predominantly you're preserving and protecting. So that's the most important thing. Let's see, Charlene had, she said the hearing was 1/26, an effective date. Well, Charlene, I spoke to Maryland Legislative yesterday and it's still pending to my knowledge, but obviously it's a dynamic, stay tuned. And Drew asked, how does PG County monitor that HOAs are fully funded and in compliance with their law? Assuming Maryland would need to duplicate a similar process. Well, Drew, that a lot of it, the complaints in part would come through from homeowners where the board fails to reserve properly. And typically where that gets, I suspect will get flagged most often, is there's a special assessment. Well, why was a special assessment coming through? And Michelle might have already dealt with this. I mean, it's a little early, but if a board isn't fully funded, as they're required to now in Prince George's County, and they have roofs fail, if they come up with $100,000 special assessment, the question of, well, why are we not just bringing it from reserves? Why are we having a special assessment after the fact? I think that's really one of the ways that'll come up. The bills don't have, I'll say, a statement that there's a reporting requirement to the county or to the state. It doesn't go through that way, but it's the law. And everything's got to comply with the law. Otherwise, you're dealing with potential lawsuits or complaint to the Attorney General's office. Michelle, have you dealt with any snags yet in Prince George's County?
Not yet. And I can kind of compare it to in Virginia. There's been a law that associations are required to have reserve studies done for much longer. I think it was around 2002 when that was enacted. And so we do still encounter associations. It's a new board and they come across the law and didn't realize. The association says they didn't know, they've never had a reserve study done. And I always tell them there's no reserve study police. There aren't really, you don't have to submit the reserve studies and make sure that you are compliant, but it is, to Ellen's point, if a homeowner complains to the state, and that usually would come with special assessments or things like that, then that's when you will come into trouble with it.
Excellent. That's all the questions I see. How about you, Michelle? Kim?
Yeah, that's
I
it.
think Ruth asked if the new pending state law will require reserve studies for HOAs and condos. And I think the answer for that is yes, right? And co-ops.
Correct. All three types of communities. It's across the board. Yes. So, all right.
Well, thank you so much for your time, everyone. We
everybody.
really appreciate your time and you spending your Friday morning with us. We hope it was helpful. And if any other questions do come up, we're all here and happy to help.
Thank you.